Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here, episode 2506. Delighted to have Dan McCarthy back with us, who more and more people are saying Dan is one of my favorite, if not my very favorite guests on your show. And I agree. I always enjoy talking to Dan. Dan, it seems like I've known you for almost forever, maybe not quite half the time I've been on this planet, but somewhere in that general ballpark. Dan is vice president of the for the Collegiate Network at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which I've had a very good relationship with over the years. And I have read many, many articles with profit from Modern Age, which Dan edits. Modern Age has been around since, I guess, 1957. Or am I confusing that with Regnery Publishing?
No, you got it exactly right, 57.
Okay, 57. So a long time, and all the luminaries have been published in it. So it's very, very much worth reading. You can check it out at modernAgeJournal.com. He's also a syndicated columnist. And one of the places you can read his columns is the New York Post. And every time a Dan McCarthy column comes out, I just drop everything and read it. So, Dan, you said I was thinking to myself, I want to talk to Dan, but I don't exactly know what about. And then I told you I skimmed through your Twitter feed and I thought, okay, now I know. I got a bunch of interesting things you posted there. So the first thing is simply an update since the last time we spoke. Last time we spoke, we were talking about the Libertarian Party convention and things related to that. But we had talked about what would happen to Donald Trump if he actually got convicted with one of these many cases. There are many charges against him. It seemed likely that something would stick, regardless of the merits. And indeed, of course, that has happened. We haven't had the sentencing yet at the time we're recording this. But you said on Twitter something along the lines of, this was maybe about a week and a half ago, if after all this, the worst that's going to happen to him is he's gone down 2 points, then he's actually looking pretty strong for November, because this is the worst news week he's going to have, and that was all it did to him. So because I had wondered what will happen, won't it? I thought it would hurt him more. Because I thought more people wouldn't understand the crooked nature of the legal system these days. But I don't know, maybe they do.
Yeah, I mean, Trump has defied gravity before. So back in 2016, when the Access Hollywood video came out, you had Trump on tape using vulgar language and, describing, sexual harassment of women or, various things that people thought, kind of reinforced the worst impressions people had of Donald Trump. And yet that blew over in the course of about a week. It did not stop him from winning the 2016 election. This conviction that he has in New York now is, I think, even less significant in terms of what it's going to do in November than the Access Hollywood tape was, because the Access Hollywood tape came later in the election cycle. The Access Hollywood tape, it at least involved words that Donald Trump had actually spoken. It had a direct impact. People could tell you, okay, here's what's wrong with saying what Donald Trump said. With this court conviction for misfiling paperwork related to paying off a mistress over something that is actually a federal crime, but the federal government didn't prosecute it because it really is a very flimsy case. So instead, you had a very biased jury and a very biased judge taking up a case that was brought by a prosecutor who said he was out to get Donald Trump when he was running for election. This whole complex, effort to take down Donald Trump in the state of New York, I think, first of all, voters just can't wrap their minds around it. They don't know what the heck this is all about. And, so it's less concrete than what was happening in 2016. And so I expected it to have less effect. When you look at the polls that have come out, in the month or so since the conviction, they haven't shown much change. So some of them have a small decline in support for Donald Trump. But others, on the other hand, still have Donald Trump up by 2 points. So overall, it looks like a wash, even in the immediate, sort of aftermath of all the massive coverage that the conviction received. So I don't think that's going to be any stronger come November. I think that's going to be a weaker issue in people's minds come November. The sentencing, on the other hand, I mean, I don't know what's going to come of that. And it seems unlikely that the judge would be so biased that they would try to impose a much harsher than normal penalty for the conviction. But you never know. I mean, they could try to, impose a jail term. Short of that, however, you're most likely looking at, community service or a fine, something that would be, quite minor.
Oh gosh, if they gave him community service, I can only imagine how he would turn that to his advantage, right? I mean, I can't think of it now, but there would be some way that he would make that a massive win.
Oh,
for
totally.
himself.
So just imagine you're a presidential candidate. You're out there picking up trash off the street in the park. And you say, "Hey, as president, I'm going to clean up all the trash."
This would be the coolest thing. I mean, honestly, I was afraid that people saying that this would backfire were engaged in wishful thinking. That, I wish this would backfire. Unfortunately, I don't think people are alert enough for that to happen. But I don't know. Again, if he were to make a spectacle out of something like that, it could definitely work in his favor. So I was curious to know your thoughts about that. I really, and there were a lot of people, not necessarily never Trumpers, people who had supported him in the past, who were concerned that there was no plan B for if he gets convicted, then what? Then what? Then we lose a huge swath of the public, and this is our nominee, and what are we supposed to do? Well, it seems like that has now come to pass. It's now come and gone, and he's lived to tell the tale, it looks like.
Yeah, we've seen over and over again since 2016 any number of incidents where conventional wisdom said, this is the turning point. This is the time when all the marginal Trump supporters and everyone who has been sort of sitting on the sidelines but now might be actively anti-Trump because of the Access Hollywood tape or because of January 6th, whatever the issue might be. There have been a number of high-profile incidents which if ever the things were going to change, you would have thought that was the time when they would have changed. And now it seems to me that the conviction and the sentencing, these are just more things in the same sequence. And none of them have made a difference. And they haven't made a difference because fundamentally what the Trump phenomenon is about is not Donald Trump himself, despite what the media would tell us, despite even what Trump himself might think. It's actually about Trump's indictment of a very corrupt establishment in this country. And that real fact never changes, no matter what dirt people bring out about Donald Trump, no matter what setbacks he faces in a court of law. Nothing that people can say about Donald Trump is going to make the ruling class in this country any more honest or any more respected by the public. And Donald Trump, because he continues to be outspoken in attacking it, continues to be seen by the people as their champion, regardless of these attacks upon him.
All right, so I want to talk about something a little bit different. I've been thinking a lot about the impact of the internet on American society. Now, we like to make fun of Paul Krugman for his famous quotation all those years ago that within 5 years we'll all see that the internet's effect on the economy was no greater than that of the fax machine. Okay, well, nobody's perfect, let's say. But I think I had a more sanguine view than might have been justified. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't want to do away with it. I mean, where would the world be without the Tom Woods Show, after all? So I don't want to do away with it. And I do think that it's made it possible for a lot of people to find out about ideas they couldn't have found out about before. I think it's made it, just the fact, did you see that picture the other day, Dan, of Chuck Schumer supposedly grilling at his daughter's house?
Oh, that was classic.
So he's got this, I guess most people probably saw it. He's got hot dogs and hamburgers on the grill. The hamburgers are all raw, and he's got cheese on one of them, which any person grilling knows you cook the burger, then the last minute you throw the cheese on. So they are roasting him, and he was saying that he was in Father's Day heaven. The purpose of that being to suggest to the public that he's just like you. On Father's Day, he wants to grill some burgers, and they can't, for some reason, they can't even pretend to be normal. With a simple thing like that, they can't even pretend to be normal. And so because of the internet, he had to actually take that picture down.
That's right.
Because everybody was roasting him. And then you look at the comment sections a lot of times, and you say, well, maybe we're not a majority, like a reliable majority, but we got a lot of people who understand what's really going on right here. So I can't say it's a net bad. It's not. But I do think that because the internet can weave its way into every nook and cranny of the entire world, it does mean that fads and slogans and icons can spread very, very quickly. For instance, I wonder if the transgender movement would be where it is now if it weren't for the internet. So do you have this feeling too that it's a mixed bag?
I do. One of the things I worry about also is that the internet was held out in the very beginning as being a permanent record of everything that would be written, everything that had been published on the internet. And in fact, it hasn't turned out to be that. You have link rot, you have servers go down. The Internet Archive Project even isn't able to maintain everything. So a lot of what is published online is ultimately lost over time. And I think that's, as someone who studied history, as I know you did, this bothers me, this sense that, an enormous amount of what's happening is actually going to be lost and irrecoverable. And I think that ties in with your point about fads, because a lot of young people who are accessing the internet today, they're seeing what's immediately available, and they have no sense of historical perspective. They don't even know what the internet looked like 10 years ago, and they have very little sense of what the inside of a library looks like, what it's like to look at a card index or to look at archives of newspapers or magazines. None of that is part of the media environment for folks today. Instead, it's all in whatever's immediately available on your phone or on your computer screen. And of course, now we have this AI fad, which is also trying to produce enormous quantities of new content, most of it of a very low caliber. AI is very, very good at doing a few simple things, but when you try to use it to replace actual human thought, you wind up with something that is just stupid and often inaccurate. And yet, a lot of companies, because they're caught up in this fad, are trying to implement this immediately. And as a result, the internet as a whole, and this certainly applies to the social media, but it applies to the search engines as well, has become a lot junkier and just a lot harder to get through and find valuable information than it had been even a few years ago.
Hey folks, today I've really got to grab you by the collar. Life is nice and predictable until it isn't. We are not immune to tragedy, but you can mitigate its effects if you plan ahead and give your family a financial safety net to protect against some of the unknowns. And the easiest and best way to do that is with Policy Genius, which is the country's leading online insurance marketplace. It makes choosing the right policy for your family easy and quick. And if you're thinking, well, life insurance might be nice, but there's no way I can afford it, consider this. With Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options are 100% online and let you avoid unnecessary medical exams. I got life insurance for the obvious reason. I want my family taken care of. And now that I have it, I enjoy tremendous peace of mind. And remember that policy at work may not be enough, and it may not follow you if you change jobs. Policy Genius makes all this easy. Just a few mouse clicks stand between you and comparing quotes from America's top insurers. They're unbiased and have an excellent reputation, as you can see from their thousands of 5-star reviews on Google and Trustpilot. Well, get peace of mind by finding the right life insurance with Policy Genius. Head to policygenius.com or click the link in the description or on the show notes page to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com. And of course, now we have the problem, as you mentioned, with younger people, of parents worrying about, not just what kind of content is my child accessing, but what kind of stuff is my child getting swept up in by means of an unusual and novel form of peer pressure, of seeing that apparently everybody thinks this particular way, or a huge number of people think this particular way. So I suppose I'd better think this particular way. I mean, it's one thing if four of your friends at school say you should smoke a cigarette behind the building with us, but when it looks like millions and millions of people have the same emojis and the same avatar and the same this and that, it's hard to resist that. I mean, when you're 13, 12 or 11, it's an awkward time in your life. You don't want to be the loner. Most people are not Ron Paul at age 11, willing to be the lone no vote in their little society. And it's hard. It puts an awful lot of pressure on them. And if they don't have this technology, then they're viewed as oddballs. They're kind of outcasts. They're not able to communicate with their friends the way the other friends are. So it's also put parents in a weird position.
Yeah, it's the flip side of one of the advantages that were touted about the internet from the very beginning. So It used to be that if you were a Rothbardian libertarian or if you were an anti-war conservative, how are you going to find people within your own local community who had the same sort of knowledge and interests that you had? Well, with the internet, that became an easy thing to do. But on the flip side, if you have interests that are, bizarre or perverse, that also becomes much easier to find a community that caters to those kinds of things. So the internet, which in a way, it's the internet, takes human nature and kind of magnifies both the good parts and the bad parts. Right. I think that's true of many forms of technology.
In that sense, it's also like capitalism itself.
It is, yeah. And of course, the challenge in this is to try to, at the same time as you have these new technologies that are making possible both good things and bad things that previously had been very difficult, this is exactly the time when you need to have the culture and, households, parents, exercising much stronger judgment than before and saying, okay, here's how we're going to, teach our kids to take advantage of the good things on the internet and to shun the bad things. But at the very same time this technology is coming to be, you also have, I think, the standards in general in our society were falling, and that not only were parents often becoming rather more permissive, but society as a whole had a very permissive attitude towards a number of things. And unfortunately, that's exactly the wrong combination. When you have a technology which is going to bring out the worst as well as the best, having a permissive attitude in general is going to be very, very damaging. So now, now we've reached a point where we see the damage and we see some of the bizarre things that have, become really a form of peer pressure that's, coming from a screen rather than coming from actual peers, from people that next to you, being imposed on young people. That it's terrible. I mean, it's leading these young people to mutilate themselves, to, undergo, not just tremendous psychological pressures, but to really, inflict self-harm or to go to, corrupt physicians who may be inflicting harm on them. We're in this situation now because we, when we should have been thinking about what these communications channels and the things they were exposing to people, young people to, at the time when we should have been thinking about these questions, we weren't. And so as a result, we now have to deal with the damage after the fact, which, in some ways is to be expected. It's human beings are always lacking in forethought, which, if people were capable of perfect forethought, we would never have fallen from Eden, right? But instead, we learn our lessons after the fact. So, that's part of being human. So on the one hand, it's dismaying, but on the other, it's not something you can wish away.
So we're talking about social trends that are aggravated by this technology, but I can also think about ways it affects me as an individual, which are not particularly dramatic, but nevertheless, they are something. I think about, for example, Twitter. I'm someday, I guess I probably will be roped into calling it X. I'm hoping to push that day farther and farther into the future. But the point is, I sometimes get some of the ideas for the things I write about from what I see people writing about there, because they'll bring articles to my attention that I hadn't seen, or they'll have an interesting perspective I hadn't thought of. And so I'll go through the people I follow and I'll say, oh, here's something. I'll tell people about what this person is saying. And so it's a great resource for me. And it's also great that from time to time, I'll say something and I'll discover that, several people of very great significance also thought it was valuable and retweeted it. Well, there's a certain, it's flattering, and it's nice and it's pleasant to see that from time to time. But on the other hand, as I'm going through to see if there's anything newsworthy to talk about, I invariably get drawn into arguments. Now, you, Dan, have a different temperament from mine. I think you are much more capable of saying, of believing in the fundamental conservative idea that the world is flawed and is not perfectible. And there are tons of people at this very moment whose heads are filled with all the wrong ideas, and there's not a thing I can do about it. But I find it hard to accept that, Dan. So I'm going through Twitter and I'm getting agitated. I'm agitated. Like, I don't want to know how dumb the world is. I don't want to have it in my face 24 hours a day. I don't want every single person on earth, regardless of how much they've bothered to read about something, to feel entitled to an opinion on it that they just thoughtlessly spread around the world. That drives me nuts. And it causes me annoyance that takes away some of my tranquility. I mean, I know this probably sounds like nitpicking, but it does bother me.
Yeah, There's a flip side, though. I think it's good to have that kind of annoyance. It's a spur to action, and it keeps keeps the edge sharp. I try to strike a balance, and you can often tell on Twitter when something has finally irritated me to a point where I just can't, keep that balance anymore, and I have to say something that's going to be, fairly on point. Let's put it that way. For example, there was a statement about 2 weeks ago where David Frum, of all people, posted some sanctimonious, remark about how
I've got it right here. Can I read it?
Yeah, read it verbatim.
I'm going to read it because I saw your comment and I think I retweeted your comment. But he said, advanced democratic societies are very reluctant to wage war, but adept at it when pushed into it. Their adversaries are less inhibited about lower-level violence, but not so good at war when they succeed in provoking it. That's the fundamental asymmetry we're debating on X, he says. And then can I read what you wrote?
Go for it.
All right. You write, a salesman for the Iraq War, which is such a great way to describe David Frum, says advanced democracies wage war reluctantly. Argue they're all good if you want, but don't pretend the U.S. hasn't been at war virtually nonstop since 1991. In that time, what region of the world has become more secure, liberal, or pro-American? And so what's great about that response is that we're subjected to platitudes like what Frum has to share with us all the time. But as soon as you have one good follow-up question, they've got nothing.
Yeah, I was recently in a discussion here in Washington, D.C. with some, experts on foreign aid and African politics. And very similarly to the Frum remark, there were some platitudes mentioned by these speakers where they were saying, well, it's so terrible that, certain African governments and certain, foreign entities like China and Russia are constantly casting aspersions on America's really well-meaning and benevolent, healthcare initiatives in Africa. And so you have that statement, which, seems fair enough. Okay, yeah, it's bad to say, that American healthcare initiatives are, necessarily aiming to subvert government or something like that. There's plenty of real humanitarian effort, especially by private, Western entities that goes into Africa and other parts of the world. But at the same time, the same panelists were also saying we need to use our soft power to, sort of push for more leverage in these countries. And one of them was saying we can actually sidestep the governments of these African countries, and we need to appeal directly to the people. And so I asked a question during the Q&A session of this panel. Don't we get offended whenever foreign governments decide to sidestep our government and go directly to the American people by sponsoring, publicity campaigns or media? I mean, we see, it's called election subversion anytime you have a foreign government putting money into U.S. media or trying to go to the American people directly and sidestep, intergovernmental relations. So I said, why should African governments look at us any more benevolently than we look at, sort of Russian publicity efforts in America or Chinese publicity efforts in America? I mean, all of this, regardless of whether the message is good or bad, is, an attempt to have a government that isn't yours try to drive your public, your people, in a certain direction. And you can see why anyone would be concerned about that. And the panel didn't really have a good answer to that. They said, these African leaders, they look at civil society as a bad thing all the time anyway, so you might as well just go ahead and appeal to the people. What I was trying to get at with my question is not just that African leaders might have good reason to be suspicious of Western, appeals directly to their publics, but also the idea that the sort of policy elite in America, in Washington, D.C. in particular, just doesn't view any government as legitimate other than themselves. They have this, sense of, universal human rights, which they alone understand, and they alone are, kind of self-authorized to go out and enforce upon the entire world. And so they see themselves, even though they aren't elected by any African people, these guys in Washington, D.C. see themselves as appointed by, you can't even say appointed by God because they don't believe in God. They're appointed by some nebulous sense of universal human rights to go out there and basically overthrow any government all around the world. But they get offended when these governments actually say, wait a minute, your guys coming over here and trying to do all these things, they're actually kind of subversive and they're actually a threat to us. We're supposed to pretend that, this doesn't happen. We're supposed to pretend that, the U.S. is entirely benevolent, that it never has a self-interest here, that our elites are, uniquely selfless. And it just, even if you want to argue that your position is correct and that, yes, you're going to use whatever Machiavellian means in order to advance it, at least just make the case that you're correct and that that's what you're doing. Don't try to, tell everyone that it's, that this is something completely different from what it actually is.
Hey folks, the very night that I'm recording this, I'm welcoming the Tom Woods Mastermind to my house for our latest meeting. These are some of my most successful followers. And I discovered at our last mastermind meeting that some of my most successful followers are using Crowd Health. One of them told another Crowd Health user in the room, "My wife's hip replacement surgery was $500, and that was it." Well, why is that? Why are these people using it? Because American health insurance is frustrating and expensive, claims denials are becoming more common, and can I take a wild guess that the Affordable Care Act did not wind up making your care more affordable? That's why Crowd Health was created. It's not health insurance. It's a better way to pay for health care through crowdfunding. Because let's face it, your insurance policy is opaque and full of surprises, and your premiums are going up every year, and you feel taken advantage of. Well, Crowd Health is doing things differently. Here's how it works. For $175 for an individual or $575 for a family of 4 or more, you'll get access to a community of people who are willing to help out in the event of an emergency. You get access to telemedicine visits, discounted prescriptions, and so much more without doctors' networks getting in the way. Well, let Crowd Health help with your healthcare needs. Get started today for just $99 per month for your first 3 months. Go to joincrowdhealth.com/woods. Crowd Health is not insurance. Learn more at joincrowdhealth.com/woods. That's joincrowdhealth.com/woods. Let's actually jump over to something you wrote that I think people will find interesting about the book 1984. Here we are 40 years after that fictional account of that year. And what has panned out, a lot of times people like to say, oh, Orwell, George Orwell, call your office, or, we'll describe things as Orwellian, or we'll say Orwell was a prophet. And, certainly we can say plenty of what's in that book, could be said to have come to pass in one form or another. But in your column about it, you suggest that it's come about, but maybe not in exactly the form we expected.
Yeah, when people think about George Orwell's 1984, they think about it as a fable about the Soviet Union and maybe the danger that a Soviet style of totalitarianism could come to the West. Now, there's two interesting things to say about that right from the beginning. It's true that Orwell was certainly thinking about Stalinism and the Soviet Union, but he was also thinking about the wartime West. And that, striking image throughout the novel of the poster of Big Brother with eyes that follow you across the room, that actually wasn't based on a Soviet propaganda poster. That was based on a famous World War II British propaganda poster. So Orwell, even though he was very much a supporter of the war against the Nazis, was someone who understood, just as F.A. Hayek and others did, the relationship between war and the spread of totalitarianism, and the danger that even those who were fighting totalitarian powers, by adopting totalitarian methods or techniques, even relatively minor ones like propaganda posters, they could in fact be setting their society on the path toward a more abusive form of statism. So that's one thing. But there's an even deeper layer to 1984 into Orwell's work. And that is that Orwell is deeply concerned about the honesty and integrity of language. And 1984 is all about that. And, obviously this new form of language, newspeak as it's called in the novel, is an attempt to subvert not just the honesty of language, but thought itself. And Orwell was very concerned about that. And he saw that as being something that could happen not just in a totalitarian society, but even in relatively free and democratic societies as well. So what you have happening in America today, where something like the meaning of the word woman or discussion of the reproductive organs now has to be changed because transgenderism says, well, you can't refer to a woman as having this particular set of organs. You have to instead not just be unclear about what the word woman means, but also you now have to use terms like front hole or just all these other absurdities that are also obscenities. this kind of mutilation of the language is at the heart of 1984. It's at the heart of this dystopia that Orwell constructs. And what's really horrifying is that we haven't had this imposed upon us by a totalitarian state. Now, certainly the state that we have is bad enough and is doing a lot to promote this. But to see so many private entities that are actually on the cutting edge of this, the universities and the media, a lot of professional associations, even corporate America, that's really shocking. Because, Orwell was thinking, is it possible that one lone individual, with great resolve and fortitude, could that person withstand all the power of the state to try to break his will? And of course, 1984 is a very pessimistic book, and it shows Winston Smith being crushed ultimately by the power of the state and the party. But, here in 21st century America, even without facing that totalitarian state, we're still doing this to ourselves. And we're doing it, out of virtue signaling, out of seeking, sort of minor incentives and minor advantages in debates or in elections or in, moving up the corporate ladder. It's conformity itself that's driving us in that direction instead of the thought police and this totalitarian apparatus. And that's a horrifying, statement about human nature. But at least I think if we're willing to recognize what's happening, that we really are moving in the direction that Orwell had warned about, even without totalitarianism forcing us in that direction. Hopefully, if we at least recognize that, we can then start to confront it and change the way we act and, reject this kind of, sort of Big Brother mentality. And of course, Big Brother, he's meant to be this provider figure, right? It's a socialist state in 1984, but Orwell, who was himself a socialist, was aware that this temptation towards finding some sort of provider who's going to look after you morally as well as materially, that this could be a temptation that any kind of society faces, not just one that is being ruled by a totalitarian power. You see it in Alexis de Tocqueville as well. He was worried about what he called democratic despotism, which would be when people voluntarily give up their self-responsibility and their own, sort of minds and souls to some sort of massive tutelary power, simply because they don't want the burden of having to be responsible for their own lives, their own well-being, and their own morals. I think there's a tremendous amount of truth to that Tocquevillian as well as Orwellian prophecy of our future.
Well, that key moment about 2 + 2 equaling 5, and the demand that he accept that, that's the aspect of it that is so chilling, that you have to internalize a lie and repeat it and believe it. Now, in our society today, I don't think they care if you believe it, as long as you understand who's running things and that you are expected to at least outwardly express your devotion to the various pieties that are expected of you. But it's still the same, qualitatively the same kind of thing, because there are multiple falsehoods that I am expected to believe and repeat and defend and condemn anyone who rejects them as an extremist. And you're right, that what's worse about it is that I'm not strictly being forced to do this by an absolutely overwhelming political force that very, very few people would have the strength to withstand. But rather it's, as you say, social pressures that pressure us into doing things for, sometimes dumb reasons. I understand some people, they just don't want to lose their jobs. But even so, the very fact that the fashionable thing would be to say these untrue things also says there's something sick about the society. Why isn't it fashionable to repeat the kinds of truths that every civilization rests on? How did that go out of fashion?
And the novel's quite clear about this. So you have, the party is all about power, and the party is about control of reality. And the party's, one of its central doctrines is that there is no external reality. There is only the reality that is manufactured by the party. And this actually is very close to the set of beliefs that is held by many of the radicals who are pushing these forms of identity politics and these forms of, reality control and manipulation. And the point of, 2 + 2 is 5, it's not that the party is deeply invested in a new mathematics or in,
right,
what's going to follow consequentially from doing that math. It's rather they simply want to prove that they have this power over human beings and that you cannot resist them, even when it comes to something you think is as basic and fundamental as 2 + 2 being 4. And of course, what is Winston Smith's job in the novel? He is a censor who goes back and retroactively changes historical records. He goes and changes old newspapers. He goes and changes old speeches and makes them reflect whatever the new party line is. And I'm struck by how today Wikipedia and other online encyclopedias, in fact, even print encyclopedias, I suspect, dictionaries, and dictionaries, think about that. So, one of the characters in 1984 is literally writing the Newspeak dictionary. And he says, well, when we rewrite this dictionary, it's going to change the way you think because these are going to be the only words that are available. Well, our dictionaries, our encyclopedias, all of them are rewritten to conform retroactively to today's political correctness. And you see that not only in the change of various kinds of language that may apply to almost anything, but you certainly see it in, sort of extreme cases where, Bruce Jenner, who was born a man, decided to become or adopt a female identity, has to be referred to as if Bruce Jenner was always, female from the beginning. He's not female now even, but to change records to say that, even from the beginning, this person would always have been referred to as a woman, it's insane. And yet this is considered to be, mandatory. Or, and you see these corporate drones who, put pronouns in their emails. And of course, what are they going to do, right? If you're just some publicist for some major corporation, even if you don't buy into this stuff, you can't, afford to be the one lone person standing up against the consensus. So it goes to show that and it actually reflects back on also what you had said a few minutes ago. When you have this kind of fad, how can you resist it? How can you, stop it, especially once it becomes, institutionalized? So if in higher education, you were to make a point of fighting this stuff, you're just not going to get your PhD. They won't award it to you. Or if you do get a position, you're going to be hounded out, of your, even if you have tenure, you're probably going to be hounded out. We've seen again and again cases of this happening. If you're in corporate America, you're going to get fired or not promoted. You've got this entire apparatus, which again, it's not sending the thought police around to your house to beat you up or make you disappear, to vaporize you, as Orwell says. Instead, it's about 1,000 sort of softer forms of coercion that are imposed on us. And, fighting it is, sometimes it seems crazy, right? Because, why are these conservatives constantly talking about transgenders? There's not that many of them really out there. How big of an issue is this really? But the fact is, if you start conceding on these margins, you wind up actually giving up a whole lot more than you thought you were giving up to begin with.
Well, no doubt. And, it's not like I'm by nature just a contrarian. I know people might think that, but I'm really not. I've kind of been forced into the position that I've taken over the years. I don't want to be a contrarian. I don't want to function in society in the knowledge that almost everybody I encounter, it may be in some cities, for example, would be absolutely appalled to know my opinions. I don't particularly relish that. I don't take delight in that, but I believe in them deeply, and I can't change that just for social acceptance. But I wonder sometimes, it must be very nice to move through society knowing that every major institution supports you. Every major institution has the same obsessions that you have. You probably got those obsessions from those institutions. That must be a much more ironic kind of existence than what I have. But it's not one that I can adopt because I can't say 2 + 2 = 5. I can't be part of this. But it is hard. I look at people who they call people like you and me that the nastiest names in the book, but I think, at least on some level, I used to kind of respect people who had like out there ideas because I thought it took some guts to have them. I don't think that kind of respect is being shown to you and me nowadays. Can I ask you one more thing though before we wrap up? I was completely unrelated. This is obviously, if this wasn't obvious up to now, this is more or less a potpourri episode inspired by the Dan McCarthy Twitter feed. Tory Anarchist, by the way, is his handle on Twitter, so you can follow him there. But you wrote a piece about your state where you live now, Virginia, and you noted that state has gone for the Democrats all the way back to 2004, but there's a possibility all of a sudden that in 2024, a Trump victory is conceivable. And I'm curious to know how that is when you look at the numbers. It looks like Trump has very heavy negatives. So how, of all possible candidates, would it be Trump who would break that curse, potentially anyway?
Well, the Democrats and the Republicans in the state of Virginia are a little bit different from what their national profile is. So today, I think most people understand the Republican Party is very much the Donald Trump party. It is quite populist. It's still very religious. And it generally is not terribly enthusiastic about neoconservatism and, especially the foreign policy agenda that the neocons were very fond of. In Virginia, there is a Trump element to the Republican Party, but Virginia is one of the very few places where there actually is a concentration of neoconservative voters. There are, a lot of government employees in Northern Virginia. There are a lot of employees, not a huge number, but enough in close elections. There are lots of employees of, think tanks that are still living in the Bush era as far as their philosophy is concerned. So there actually is a strong neoconservative element in Virginia, enough to be, marginally effective in certain elections. And Trump has generally, you've had a strong never Trump vote within Virginia. But right now, because Biden has screwed up so many of the issues that neocons care about a great deal, whether that's Ukraine or whether that's, Middle East and Israel policy, a lot of these neocons who really don't like Trump say, well, you know what, we've got to get rid of Biden one way or another. So the Virginia Republican Party, I think, is probably more strongly united behind Trump today than it had been, in 2020 or in 2016. And that makes a big difference. But the other difference is on the flip side, which is that the Democrats in Virginia have actually been a bit smarter than most of the Democrats around the country. So going back to the, George W. Bush years, to the 2006 midterm elections, for example, Democrats in Virginia realized, hey, we're going to lose election after election to the Republicans, as they were doing in the 1990s, unless they're able to get some of the rural vote and some of the, sort of blue-collar white vote. And to do that, the Virginia Democrats started fielding candidates like Jim Webb, who became a senator in Virginia in 2006. Jim Webb was a Vietnam veteran. Jim Webb had been Secretary of the Navy as a Republican in the Reagan administration. This was the kind of Democrat that if you ran in Virginia in the early 2000s, you could actually win that seat for the Democrats at a time when Virginia seemed to be a very safe state for Republicans. It seemed to be part of the Solid South. Tim Kaine, who's a senator from Virginia today, was also not nearly as quasi-conservative as Jim Webb was, but Kaine was also the kind of candidate who was designed to or chosen to appeal to rural whites and working class blue-collar voters in general and whites in particular. And of course, Tim Kaine was Hillary Clinton's running mate in 2016, precisely because the Clinton campaign was smart enough to recognize, hey, we've got a big problem with these kinds of voters. Tim Kaine is someone we need to, keep them on board. And of course, Trump in most states was enough to more than counteract the influence of Tim Kaine. But Tim Kaine was actually probably somewhat important for Hillary Clinton winning Virginia by 5 points in 2016. Now, in 2020, you had all of the never Trump Republicans voting against Trump, in the presidential election. You also still had Joe Biden pretending to be a kind of, old style Democrat, could remind you of maybe JFK and, a more working class rooted Democrat, appealing to, rural whites and working class whites. So in 2020, Trump, lost Virginia by about 10 points. But I think both of those things have changed, however, as we go into 2024. I think Trump now has more of the rural white vote in Virginia is probably sympathetic to Trump once again. There's no Tim Kaine on the Democratic ticket this time. There's Kamala Harris. There's no, 2020 conditions when people were blaming Trump for everything that was wrong with the country. Instead, it's 2024, and everyone's blaming Joe Biden, quite rightly, for things that are wrong. And then, the never Trump element of the party in Virginia is starting to say, well, we still don't like Trump, but, Biden's policies on Ukraine and Israel are such a dramatic failure. We're going to choose any alternative. So I think that's what makes Virginia a competitive state in 2024.
All right. Well, I guess we'll leave it there, even though I really do like asking for predictions, but I hate giving them. I hate being asked for them. So I think today, Dan, I'm going to follow the golden rule, and I'm going to do unto you as I would prefer you do unto me and not ask you for a prediction. And
well,
instead,
my rule is whenever asked for a prediction, I don't like giving them either. But whenever I'm asked for one, I like to give a bold prediction, even if it's going to be likely wrong. because most of the fun is in the prediction itself, right? Nobody
Okay, so do you have one for us? You seem almost giddy to give it to us.
What's the question? What's the...
Well, I mean, what's going to happen in November?
Well, I do think Trump's going to win. And that's not even a bold prediction. I think that's actually where the data right now are pointing. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I don't think it's, a sure shot, but I think Trump, he's ahead right now as far as I can tell. I think he's going to get a boost from picking his VP. It's going to be a small boost, but that's still a positive thing. And I think he's already over the worst of the legal difficulties. So I feel good about it.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe too good about it. Maybe I am a little superstitious about predicting things that I'd like to happen. So I do worry. But
all right. Well,
the facts seem to be leaning in that direction.
As Michael Scott says, I'm not superstitious, but I'm a little stitious. So, but I like your analysis, and I think you're probably right. We did do an episode on who that VP candidate is likely to be. I think we've gotten a little bit of clarification since then. But we won't know until we know. When we finish recording, because I do want to wrap this up, I'll run by the one I think it might end up being. But anyway, Dan McCarthy, check him out. You'll see his columns in the New York Post. But you should go to modernagejournal.com, and you know what? Subscribe to the thing. You'll get it digitally, but there is something civilized. We were talking today about the way society has degenerated. And one way it has is, I know I sound like the old man who hates technology, but not holding a physical printed copy of something in your hand. I think I get the benefits of a Kindle, and it can have 1 million books on it. I get that in the abstract, but in practice, I want to hold that physical copy. And when you see a copy of Modern Age come in the mail, and you're going to sit in your recliner and enjoy reading it with a physical copy of that issue in your hand, you're going to feel like you are, in a small way, helping to restore civilization. I hope you feel the same way, Dan.
Absolutely. And right now, there's actually a special subscription rate. The code for it is Modern Age 1957. That's Modern Age, and then the number is 1957. All one word, no spaces. If you just put that into the subscription, code box on the, you get the digital and print subscription together for $19.57. So it's a great deal.
Wow. Can't ask for better than that. So modernagejournal.com is the website, and my thanks to Dan McCarthy. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com, and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.